All right, welcome everyone. So today's webinar is about using your ID to manage conflict. And if you think about it, this is at the very core of why ID exists, to help people understand differences and then navigate those differences so that they have a healthy synergistic relationship rather than one that is in conflict with others. So this is at the core, and I hope what we've prepared will be really valuable for you. So just to, for those of you who are new, just to share some of the logistics around our webinars. So our webinars are held every month. They are free of charge. They are a genuine, no obligation. There's no selling. There's no strings attached. This is purely to add value, make a difference, and keep showing additional ways for how you can be using your ID to live more in stride and make a greater splash in the world, make your life matter. And we choose a theme every month. And at the start of the month, like now, we unpack the topic. So today it's about using your ID to manage conflict. And that will be a lot of me presenting to you with a lot of some slides. There'll be some discussion opportunities for you to ask questions and comment. You can do that live in the webinar. I will draw breath so that you can ask your questions, but there's also the chat that you can jump into and almost run like a separate webinar. We have people on our team that monitor the chat, and they can either answer you in the chat or mention it verbally, and we can talk about it as a topic if it's warranted. And then when we come back together in a couple of weeks, that is our ID masterclass, and it's the same topic, but it's much more of an interaction, and it's where we dive into the nuances of the topic and particularly try and look at some use cases for how you can apply it. So that's where you can bring your own specific examples. It might be about you personally or one of your relationships. It might be for a client or someone that's in your world that you want to better understand how you can navigate a particular situation, and we can talk that through in our ID masterclass. So anything else? The ID masterclass that's coming up in a couple of weeks, Ian will put the link in the chat for you. So if you want to register for that today, you can. And that's the rhythm that we have each and every month. All right, with that, let's get today underway. So in terms of the topic today, what we advertised was we're going to talk about this notion of conflict, because you can't have synergy without conflict. They fall on the same axis. And so if you want synergy, it invariably brings conflict, but equally, the situations that cause conflict can be turned into ones that are synergistic. You'd hear people talk about, oh, we have complementary talents. That's an example of synergy. Then we're going to give you a practical framework for managing conflict, something you can sort of hold on to, either study or have at your fingertips to use in future. And of course, once we get past the sort of the framing of it, we're going to talk about your IDs and how they relate to conflict. All right, so when you think about conflict, falling on this axis of, from one end is conflict, the other end is synergy, I just want to put some things on the screen here to sort of frame this topic up a little bit. So the first one for me is there's really, if you think about what shifts it from conflict to synergy, from synergy to conflict, because at the end of the day, the people are the same people, but it comes down to whether or not there are differences in play, your perspective on those differences. Like, do you see them as healthy things, or do you see them as irritations? And then what about expectations? I think these three things will play, and you'll see them come alive as we dig further into the ID components. There's also the fact that when we think about conflict, it's like, okay, some of the conflict is open, like open warfare conflict. You can feel the tension, you can see the tension, you can see people verbally going at each other. But sometimes the conflict is invisible or it's disguised, and people are just stewing on it. Think about PTSD right now. PTSD, that's very prominent as an issue in the world. In Australia, we've got a lot of domestic violence visibility right now. And there's a lot of pent-up energy. That pent-up energy that people often fester on means there's a conflict going on, but it's more maybe within themselves or sort of submerged. It's not something that's as obvious. And then it can come out in, not obvious maybe, but it just that passive aggressive nature, that's a form of conflict too. So there are different forms of conflict. When we talk about your IDs a little later, it can play out differently, still within under the umbrella of conflict. Similarly, when we talk about synergy, so often we think about it as the 1 + 1 = 5. But even healthy tension, there's a book that's out that's been out for quite some time on radical candor, and this notion of having a very rigorous debate. That's a form of conflict, but it's presented in a much more synergistic way, in a positive way. So how do you get that? What is it that shifts you from one to the other? So that's what I wanted to we're going to start to unpack now is, what are the things that push you more to the left of the axis, that drive you more to conflict? And what are the things that drive you more towards the synergistic end? And I would say to you, one of the biggest things that stands out, and these are things we can become more, conscious of and intentional about, is inequality. When someone thinks they're more superior than someone else, that their way is better than somebody else, that they're more senior than somebody else, they've got some level of authority or power over some, and it's not an equal playing field, that sets you up for conflict. When people naturally see themselves as equals, you are more likely to move towards the synergistic end. Doesn't mean you will, but it's one of the important things. And then you can check things like, are you a judgmental person? Like regardless of your ID, when people feel judged, it's likely to go left. When they feel your disappointment, it's likely to go left. When they feel that there's assumptions made about what they've done and why they've done it, and you haven't even understood what their real intentions were, that puts people off and sets you up for conflict. And so often the conflict can be about something quite minuscule or short term, as opposed to focusing more on the bigger picture. So obviously, if you want to go to the right, it's sort of the opposite. Have a playing field of equality, start to understand and accept the differences. Humility is big. I mean, if you're going to be someone that, even if you are in a position of seniority or power or whatever it might be, seeing yourselves as an equal does involve some level of humility, staying curious about the situation rather than jumping to conclusions, and keeping your focus on the prize. What's the bigger picture? Like maybe it's the relationship as opposed to the thing that might appear to be the source of conflict. And so if you think about how do you then shift from one to the other, I just thought I'd cover these things here. Having an authentic desire to be in a relationship of equals. And it's easy to write those words, but in all the coaching and consulting that I find myself doing and helping people with conflict, that's probably the one. You can help them understand their IDs and they can get it intellectually, but if they don't see themselves as an equal, if they don't come to the table truly in the spirit of wanting a relationship with that person and a relationship of equals, then it's like a cognitive conversation as opposed to a genuine, heartfelt conversation to resolve the conflict. So I just think, this is so important. Now, to get to that place where it is authentic and where you are focused on the relationship and not the issue, and you do see yourself as an equal, that's normally a body of work. I find that people that do that well, they've normally put some effort into developing their EQ. They've done a lot of self-development, and it doesn't matter what their ID is. I spent some time with a young friend of mine yesterday, and she was talking about exactly this. She said, I feel like I'm on this really intense journey right now, Paul, about developing my self-awareness. And it came out of her having a number of conflicts that really surprised her. And she felt a need to dig deeper and learn a lot more about herself and how to navigate, her life. It's a journey of EQ development. So that's a big part of it. And then I will say, even for the people that have developed EQ, it's still very front of mind. There's real intention about it. It never becomes automatic, is what I'm saying. There's a skill that's developed over time, but at the point of keeping it front of mind is a constant intention. And then when you bring in the ID, we can say all this. We can say this is what you need to do. You need to be humble. You need to be equal. You need to develop your EQ. And then it comes down, yeah, but for these particular people, how do I manage the conflict? And that's the power of ID. It actually personalizes it about you, and it shows you how to navigate for each and every person, as opposed to just having a generalist strategy. Now, one of the things I wanted to include here was this concept about being in awe of differences. Because if differences are one of the sources of conflict and synergy, a lot of people try and learn about ID so they can understand the differences, tolerate the differences. But if you think about them on a spectrum, you want to actually get to the place more up to the right where you are in awe of differences. And the people that tend to enjoy synergistic relationships are the people that not only can understand the differences between themselves and others and accept them, know how to, maybe navigate them, but they're really fundamentally, like in their heart of hearts, they truly are in awe of the differences between them and other people. And again, that's not something that comes automatically. That's often a body of work that people have to do on themselves to get to that place of real acceptance and being in awe. I might just stop there in case anyone has any questions before we move on to the next section. All right, so with that backdrop in mind, then we bring in the ID and we go, okay, so when it comes to conflict and synergy, are there certain elements of ID? Like, are there some IDs that are more likely to be in conflict? Like, can you put two IDs together and go, these two, they'll be sweet, but these ones over here, like, that's going to be interesting. Like even like in a marriage or with parenting certain, adult and child or brother, sister, work colleagues, there are sometimes you look at the ID differences and you sort of go, that would be fun. Other times it's, like maybe a natural or a nice difference. You think that should be synergistic. Now, what I can tell you is there is no set of IDs that's a match made in heaven. If there aren't the things that we talked about previously, if there's not that sense of equality and awe, then everyone is set up for a challenge, no matter what your IDs. In fact, even if you have the same IDs, you can still have conflict because expectations and perspectives. Remember, we said there's differences, there's expectations, and there's perspectives. So even where you've got the same IDs, if people aren't expecting sameness, and they're expecting that because you're male or because you're female or because you're older, you should know or do differently, or you've got a different perspective about that idea, you might have framed it as, painful to you or an irritation, that will cause conflict. So are there some IDs that even thrive on differences? Like, I think some of us know that are trained in ID know that there are some IDs that are non-confrontational and thrive on collaboration. And there are others that can even cause conflict, not even know they're causing it. Some people are more vulnerable to, judgmental perspectives. So ID brings in a number of interesting elements here. And then there's this piece about, you might say, well, no, but I like conflict. I'm good with conflict. I don't seem to have much conflict, but maybe you're causing it. Maybe you're not the one dealing with it. It might be your nature. Like I remember one particular leader one time saying, I don't understand all this chaos and conflict. Like when I got here, everything was fine, and everywhere I go, it's all good. And I'm like, Scott, you're like a tornado. If you look in the front of the windscreen, everything looks beautiful. Look behind you. Look behind you. And he's like, well, where'd all that come from? I'm like, that's you. That's what happens when you show up. There's chaos, there's crises, there's urgency, and you thrive on it. But it doesn't mean that that's what the people around you thrive on. So it causes a conflict for them, even though you think everything's going great. It could be that the way you react to it, depending on your level of EQ and what development you've done, if you don't have a healthy way of dealing with, knowing how you need to best deal with conflict, maybe your reaction fuels it, and maybe the conflict that you experience may not be apparent to everyone else. It might be something inside you and it burns away in you, either that ultimately explodes or it has some serious impact on your health. So there are a number of dimensions that are coming as we dig now into the ID. There are a number of dimensions here that will sort of attack each of these different questions as we go through and talk about our framework. Any questions before I dig into that?
Yeah, Paul, I'm curious, and maybe you're going to show it on the next slide. What are the benefits of each of these? Because I see some benefits here as well. The first bullet, be in natural conflict with each other. The natural conflict would be bringing up another perspective constantly, which can drive people crazy, but there's some benefits to it as well.
Well, tell me, do you mean, I had up the piece about synergistic being the synergy NPAM. Do you mean something different?
No, I'm just suggesting that there's a benefit to each one of these as well. And I'm hearing you about the synergy of it. And there is the positive intent behind it is something too.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's really this thing about two sides of the same coin, you know. One of the things I was going to say before, like when you think about every time we talk to couples about conflict in their relationship, and you dig into what is it, right? From an ID perspective, the very thing that's now causing conflict back when they met and fell in love was the reason they fell in love, you know? So I get, like, I'm just thinking of someone right now who's an improviser, and, you know, they think, oh, that person is, I know when they fell in love, it's like, oh, because they're so much fun. And now 20 years later, they don't take anything seriously. They're just flippant. And who carries all the responsibility in the family? Me, you know? And it's like, well, that was always there, but you never saw that. Your perspective has shifted, you know? You get someone like a completer, people fall in love because they're so organized. And I love that because maybe I'm not. And then 20 years later, it's not that they're organized, it's that they're rigid and inflexible, you know? Don't want to try anything new. And you're like, well, same person, same instinct, same feature, other side of the coin. And so, yes, that's why the EQ development, to learn about what those positives are for every person and situation and how to focus on them, it's so important to how you manage conflict. So if I want to start building a framework with you for how to manage conflict. So for those of you who have attended several of these webinars before, where do we always start? No matter what it is we're trying to do, what's the first place that we always want to start from, given that we know about ID? Anyone got a suggestion?
Being in stride.
Be in stride. Thank you, Alona. The first thing always is get your own house in order and get in stride. Because if you're not in stride, several things happen, right? And I put this diagram here for those of you who haven't. This is our peak performance indicator. And when you are traveling, doing life along this green arrow here, that means you're in flow, in stride, you're at your best. If you get pulled off to the left or to the right where you are out of stride, that's when you get compromised and are not your best. But it's not just about performance and stress. It also affects the way you show up in terms of having the courage and confidence to speak your own truth. So if you're in trying to manage conflict, but you're not in a good place yourself, you tend to focus more on yourself. Whereas if you're in stride, your energy is out and your energy is more able to be empathetic to other people. So when one of the, key ingredients of managing conflict is to not only listen to the other person, but to listen for the other person. How can you do that when you're preoccupied with all your own internal stuff? You just can't. So you've got to get to a place where we suggest that on the peak performance indicator, if a 10 out of 10 is on that green arrow, really in stride, and a 1 out of 10 is way out to the left or way out to the right, you want to be like an 8, 9, or 10. If you are an 8, 9, or 10, you are much more capable of focusing externally and not being consumed by what's happening internally within you. And this is honestly probably 90% of the solution. People, there's two things about listen for others and don't react, respond. If you're in turmoil yourself, you are much more likely to be reactive. And so I would just say, if you did nothing else in your journey of personal development, but learn how to get in stride so that when you encounter differences, you're more able to see them positively, you're more able to respond and react. And when you have to actually have a conversation with somebody else, you can truly be there for them and for the greater goodness of your relationship, not trying to prove your point about, whatever's upset you. So being in stride is a huge ingredient of the 5 or 6 I'm about to show you. This one, I would weight really, really strongly. I was thinking of one of these myself recently where I was really, frustrated about something. And I'm like, if I'd have dealt with it in that moment, it wouldn't have been a good look, but by just waiting a little bit longer to get to a place where you've calmed down, get yourself more in stride, think about what's really going on, what do you really want to achieve. And I could feel my numbers changing, from like probably a 4 or 5 with that person to a much better place of, okay, no one probably intended this. So let's figure that. And you get yourself to that calmer, more reasonable situation, definitely much more in stride. It completely changed the way I would have approached that situation. So I would just say, if you're feeling really emotional about it, or the other person is, back off, wait if you can to a point where you're in a better position. I even had a conversation with someone the other day, not on this call, and it was very tense. And they said, I think we should talk at another point in time. Clunk, and I'm like, I think that's a good idea. And we did. And it was actually only a few hours later, but it was a totally different conversation when we were both able to, I think, get to a better place emotionally and more in stride. This is huge. All right. So, Mike, I see your question in the chat about interested to know which IDs are more confrontational. We'll show you shortly. All right. The second thing is, making a point, if you can, of understanding the other person's ID so you know where you're similar and different, where the conflicts might be coming from. It just gives you a frame to use. Even if you don't know their ID, there is a way around that. I'll talk about that in a minute. But if you do have the benefit, and many of you are here because you both know your ID and typically people around you, jump onto our platform, check out what their ID is, and just think about where you're similar, where you're different, and how you might navigate that. We've got slides on that to help you through it. So, for example, this is just I thought I'd spend a little bit of time on this for you about how different IDs approach conflict, because we all react to it differently depending on what our makeup is. And this is just unpacking it direction by like each instinct and each of the 8 directions. But you can see here, we're not the same. Like if I just think about verifiers, and Mike, to your question about which IDs are more confrontational, I mean, the other day I got a call from somebody saying they'd been this, so Ian, I'll mention this because it was part of the channel partner meeting. You remember, right, talking about this, and someone said, there was this really healthy debate. I thought it was fantastic. Someone else rang me and said there was all this conflict on the call, and I'm like, isn't it so interesting? Like the verifiers, when they're having a debate, they don't even see it as a conflict. Probably not even a debate. It was just like, I thought it was a really healthy conversation. And there could be people that in that same energy, if they're avoid verify. So Mike, to your question, the avoid verifiers are the drive that we typically think of as, avoiding confrontation. But there are others, you'll see in a second, there are other drives that can at times too. The important thing here is in the verify dimension, there are people that when they're asking questions, like as a verifier, they're asking questions to understand something, not realizing that even the questions were being felt as confrontation to the avoid verifier on the receiving end of them. So it's even the tone of voice, asking the same question in a way that doesn't feel like an interrogation. Like, why'd you do that? That's interrogating a negative. But if you said to somebody, wow, that's interesting. So where were you coming from with that? Or what was behind that? And you just ask the same question, but a little differently, and it lands. So it's not like a punch, that just changes that conflict dimension. Think about the authenticate drive. How do you deal with it? Firstly, you'll avoid it. There's a lot of authenticators that just don't speak up if there's no point. like we've had this before and no one does anything about it anyway, so I'm not going to say anything. It's just waste of my breath, waste of my time, not even going to turn up to the meeting. You know, and it's not that they're actually conflict avoidance, but if the environment is one where it's not actually going to manifest into anything concrete and useful, nothing's going to change. If they've formed that view, then they'll just shut it down. And typically their reason is because there's no point. If we're only going to talk about it, they want to see action. For the completers, I mean, if you think about what the complete drive is all about, it's all about harmony. So the opposite of harmony is conflict. So they're going to be conflict avoidance as well. And it doesn't mean that they can't or won't ever deal with conflict, but conflict is not their middle name. I mean, that's the opposite of what they stand for. So they'll put it off and put it off and put it off. And depending on what their other drives are, they'll probably try and deal with it themselves rather than, you know, confront it. The problem is that it starts off small and then it builds up and it builds up and builds up. And then there's one more small thing that happens, and that's like the straw that breaks the camel's back. And then it's on for young and old, you know, there's a big sort of explosion about it. And then the person on the receiving end is like, I can't believe that caused conflict. Like all I said was, it's like, well, it's not all you said. It's been coming for a month, you know, it's been building up and it just exploded. So knowing that that's how you roll, you and all the people living or working with you can manage that differently. If there's not enough time to talk it through, you're not going to start a conversation that, you know, people say, well, let's go and have a coffee. We've got 10 minutes. Let's go and talk about it. That might be fine for you as an avoid complete, but to the completer who's got a month worth of stuff to talk about, like that's just so superficial. You've even made the conflict worse to not even realize that there's so much going on inside me that we need like a couple of hours to figure this out. In fact, often you can't even just deal with it. We need to like spend time together and sort of connect and get on a roll, you know, and we build up this nice sort of connection with each other, and then it can start to come out. That's why often once a couple, for example, in a marriage have spent the weekend together, on the Sunday afternoon, it comes out, and you might be thinking, why didn't we talk about this like yesterday or the day before? Like, why is it taking so long? Well, it took so long because we had to like get on a roll and feel that connection and feel that now it was, you know, going to work. So it's really different for the completers compared to the avoid completers, for example. And then you get the improvisers who, even with conflict, will be laughing, smiling, seeing the upside of it. And I'm not saying all the time, but they tend to have more of a light, positive, optimistic view and can say things like, oh, is that all it is? Oh, no, well, that's easy. All we've got to do is, you know, because they see a way forward. And it just the words that are used, they're not meaning to be demeaning or dismissive of the turmoil that's been caused, but just the nature of who they are can be almost like adding fuel to the fire for someone who's the avoid improviser that's taken it on very personally, very internally. It's something that's, you know, maybe a really big deal to them. And there's a lot to it. It's not as simple as, you know, there's a lot to actually resolving this. And they need to feel like someone else gets the seriousness of the issue for them to feel like the conflict either is resolved or has a chance of being resolved. So we're all very different depending on our IDs. Anything anyone would like to add to this? Have I misrepresented a drive that might be dear to you? Is there something missing that you would like to add, or are there any questions about this?
Okay, so just one question. The difference between a complete thrive and avoid is that the thrive will really build up and try to fix the conflict, but then the avoid will try to get it like very quickly and move on, right?
Pretty much. Well, I think so. I'm interested to hear from some completers and some avoid completers to honor your question, but that's what I would think, Naomi. Anyone want to comment? can I ask an avoid complete person? We've got a few fairly strong avoid completes on the call, like people who are twos in that drive. Is it, you know, let's just deal with it quick here and now, deal with it, keep it quick, and we move on? Is that pretty much it for you? I can see Alona saying yes, Susie saying yes, Pam's yes, and there's three very strong avoid complete people. And by quick,
maybe they are taken out from being calm if it's not resolved quickly, right? I guess.
What was the point? Sorry.
If the conflict doesn't resolve quickly, a complete avoid will kind of shut down, right?
Well, they get bored, they get distracted, you know, their mind starts wandering off somewhere else. So you got a very short moment of attention to, you know, to really deal with it. So often people have to think through, okay, what do I really want to talk about? Because if I've got a short window of time, then, you know, don't spend half an hour getting to the point or having 15 things that you want to work through. That won't work. But what's really powerful to an avoid complete is, you know, like, what's the essence of it? Keep it short and sweet. And is there like one thing I can do? If I just do that one thing, that'll address it. So what is that? And often there is a thing, like of all the things, there might be a key thing. If they did that, that would make a difference. I've got a meeting today where I've got a few things to talk through, and I've spent a fair bit of time yesterday sort of looking at it, going, because it is for an avoid complete person. And I'm like, is there something they could do that, like this one thing, and it would like impact everything else? And then I thought of it. I don't know if it's going to be the thing, but for that person's ID, it would be a great place to probably start the conversation. Anybody else? Yeah, and just to, I see Vanessa's made a comment in the chat about, and you get over it quickly. That's my point about moving on. And even that, though, can be another source of conflict. So it's something to be careful of, because if someone's been stewing about something for a long time, even though you might deal with it and you move on, just moving on quickly can feel to the other person like, well, you weren't really hurt at all then, or maybe you didn't really get the seriousness of, like, or the burden I've been carrying. It's like, no, I got it. But the minute, what happens for an avoid complete is the minute you turn and pivot and go to the next thing, you're consumed by the next thing. It's the next thing has no connection to what we were just talking about before. It's a totally different, you know, language or situation. And so it's not that you've moved on and you're, you know, there's no emotion there. If you went back to that topic, you probably feel all the emotion again, but you just pivot and move on. So I think you've got to be careful then as a completer not to misinterpret what you see in your avoid complete, you know, partner or colleague.
This is Monica. I am a 4 in the avoid complete, and I feel like for me, I don't necessarily want to go into complete depth about it, but I want to touch it so that I know that that point is there, so that it can be addressed if the other person needs to do it. But I need to let them know that I'm aware of it. I'm here to talk about it, and then if it doesn't really go anywhere and we're done, then I move on to the next, because I don't want to sit there and focus on something that's just going to spin in a circle.
Yep. Thank you, Monica. Well said. Hey, Marlis, I see your question in the chat about use, verify, avoid, improvise. Can you just maybe elaborate on your question for us, please?
So I noticed that they, in some respects, seem opposites. The use, verify is head on, can be argumentative, but at the avoid, improvise is avoid it, just deal with it privately or internally. So in that case, and I work with a lot of people who have a strong verify and avoid, improvise ID, maybe it depends on the situation, or maybe it depends on the other drives.
Great question. Thank you. I love it when, like, as you say, things appear to be at odds with each other, and yet plenty of people have got that ID. So there's some truth to it for them. Is there anyone who's got that ID that would like to comment on how these two come together for them?
Well, for me, it's always about weighing up the risk as well. So, you know, if it's almost like if the unfairness outweighs the risk, then you speak up. But if there's a bigger risk of speaking up, sometimes you might hold your fire. And again, this is the whole of my ID playing into there as well, Marla. So, you know, with the 3, 6 in the middle. But yeah, I sort of choose my debates. So some, you know, the one Paul referenced the other day, I was in the thick of it. It was great. I was really enjoying it, but it was a very academic debate. So I didn't feel there was a risk involved. Whereas others where I think if it's more, that there's a bigger downside potential, then I might be more quiet about it. So it's going to be situational very much.
And Ian, what about Marlis's point about do you feel that for you as an 8 in Verify, you know, are you head on, are you argumentative, or do you tend to, you know, try and deal with it more internally? Is a lot of that mental machination that's going on more within you as opposed to confronting someone else?
Yeah, I think a lot more internally, and again, timing. You know, with the 3, 6 in the middle, like the timing's everything. You know, is this the right time to have the conversation? Is this going, you know, the ramifications of if, you know, if I say this, that might, you know, put other people offside, would, you know, be detrimental in the future. So there's a lot of things at play. So what I would say if I'd say my combative nature, it's usually when the 8 gets something really unexpected happens, and it's almost like, you know, this, like if you're driving, someone suddenly cuts you off, and then it's like on the horn and swearing and, you know, carrying on, because it's in the moment, they've done the wrong thing, and there's no time to like, it's just pure reaction. Whereas I think if you're being able to sort of, you're in a discussion and you can actually sit back and reflect, you can actually, you know, stand back from it and almost, you know, observe it going on around you and choose how you're going to interact with it. But
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Love the bullet under use verify. Often don't see it as conflict. It's a healthy, stimulating debate. And, you know, at times I've gone away from meeting, thought that was great. I just love that debate. It went really well. We got all different perspectives on the table. And then I'll get feedback afterwards. Oh, that meeting didn't do well, you know. And I'm thinking, I thought it was great. So that misunderstanding of is it conflict or not, I think is a really insightful one for use verify.
It's so true, Gillian, isn't it? You know, like you don't even, I think we have this definition of conflict of something where there's, you know, it's an obvious argument or tension between people. But I do find, as you know, from the work you do too, it's just really eye-opening for people to realize that their comments, their questions didn't always land as positively for others as they expected. All right, so I'll show you another matrix in a second around, so what do we do about all of this? But I think it's just really helpful to have an awareness of, firstly, for yourself, how you deal with conflict, but also for the people that you're in relationship with, how different it is for them, and just being open to it. So even if you don't know their ID, just being open to the fact that there's a difference and that they're highly likely to be different to you, and now listen for them on the impact of what has happened, you know, and how has that impacted their emotionally, you know, just that is it's like, you know, lowers the temperature if they feel the empathy from you, just because of your own awareness of these differences. All right, let's move on to the third strategy around managing conflict is, what's your mindset? So I've mentioned before about this concept of equal mindsets, and honestly, it's easy to write it. I highlighted it because I would just say, go there always. You know, it's so important to be aware of, you know, yes, you're in stride, but are you now seeing them as an equal? Don't have power. You weren't right. They weren't wrong, better or worse, just different. And that gives you a much better place to resolve the conflict from. Meeting their needs. If you're going to meet their needs, it's good to know what their needs are and even about impact. So a lot of times people debate the issue, the thing that happened. And like I said, for the completer, when the thing happened, that the straw broke the camel's back, that's not the thing. There's a much bigger story to it that's been brewing for a month. That's the bigger impact, the bigger picture. So you've got to be open to that possibility. And when you listen for that, you realize, there's been actually 25 things and there's something underneath all of that. You need to understand that. And you're wasting your time, your energy, and the relationship to try and resolve the thing that looks like it was the source of conflict. It's not the conflict at all. And to get to that space means you've got to be in a really clear and developed mindset. So let's look at the strategies for each of those drives. So the way this is worded is, if you're going to try and resolve a conflict with a person who's a strong verifier, you do the things up in the top left-hand corner. If you're going to try and resolve a conflict with someone who's an avoid verifier, you'd look at the things down here in the lower left corner, and the same with each of the other dimensions. So I'll just let you read this so you can maybe look at this for your own ID, and then I'll walk you through it and expand on some of these. You can ask your questions, maybe add to it. If you see something here you'd suggest we adjust, or we've missed and you want to add it in, we can do all of that. And then we'll send these slides out to you afterwards so that you can have these at your fingertips for managing conflict with others in future. So the first thing, let's start. Marlis mentioned before about there's a lot of verifiers and avoid improvisers that you're working with. So Marlis, I'll focus on this verified drive for you so you get some extra sort of benefit here. The way the verify mind works, and I'm one of them, is that if someone genuinely, and that's a key word, genuinely listens to your side of the story, like why did you do what you did, it completely empties your bucket of tension and hostility and opens you up to want to hear someone else's point of view. You need to hear it. In fact, it would be frustrating if someone heard you out and then say, okay, that's really good to know, I have to leave now. You'd be like, well, hang on, what about you? What's going on for you? I need to hear you. Because that fairness drive of the verifier, they want to then hear the other side, but they need to see that you've genuinely listened to theirs, even if they were wrong, because there is a why. There's a reason they did what they did, and there's a desperate need for people, for a verifier to know that you understood their why. A really critical thing, if you look at the avoid verify drive, the equivalent emotional impact is acknowledgement. If the verify needs you to hear them out and understand their why so that it lowers the temperature, the equivalent thing for an avoid verifier is showing real empathy and acknowledging where they're at and what happened. Even if they were silly to go there, even if they were wrong in their perspective, they made an assumption that they shouldn't, whatever it is, doesn't matter. It's just being genuinely acknowledging of whatever place they're in and whatever occurred for them. That diffuses it for them. That acknowledgement is huge. And then this feeling, and I have this picture for myself of your arm goes around the person and we're in this together. We're not at odds. We're not opposite each other. If we were at a table talking, I'd bring my chair around to the other side. I'd be sitting alongside you. I'd have my arm around you. Think of it like if you talk to one of your kids and be like, so what are we going to do about this? Or how do we do this now? But it's we and it's us and we're in it together. That's the feeling that the avoid verifier needs to get from you in order to move forward with the situation. And you know what? If they had that feeling, they probably don't need to talk about very much at all. That's the feeling they want to arrive at with you to be able to move forward. And so often I see people trying to come up with all these techniques and how we prepare and what we say. And I'm like, but you're on the other side of the table. Go around the other side, put your arm around them and just give them that feeling. That is key to the avoid verify. Any questions or comments? Anything anyone would want to add? All right, let's talk about the authenticate drive. So there can be all sorts of noise. Whatever it is you need to talk about, just be upfront, honest, and what's got to come out of it is, what are we going to do about it? It's all very able to talk about our feelings. That's maybe nice and important, and it's nice to have that relationship. But at the end of it, like, what's the action? What is it you want me to do, or what are you going to do? There's got to be a doing that comes out of it. Otherwise, it was just all talk. And this is a drive for action. So the authenticators need to know not what to not do, but what do you want me to do? Just be clear on that. Get to that place real quick, and end of confrontation. That's when it starts to shift to synergy. For the avoid authenticators, what happens for them is there's always a gap. And I mean, I'm a 1 in authenticate. So, you know, this is my life. There's always a gap between your intention and what you actually did and what you actually said. And when they get bundled together, that creates a mess or creates conflict. So you want to resolve the conflict, but you want to still be validated for the fact that you had good intentions and good values, that there was something clean about it all and just misunderstood. So separating those two things out. And when you get that validation that I know you would never have meant this, I know you, Paul, I know that this would have been your intention, that gets cleaned up very quickly, because that's still keeping you intact, the depth of you. And the avoid authenticate is all about the depth. And then the action piece, that's, you know, the action or whatever the issue is that might have been misunderstood, or even like I did something the other day. Oh, I know what it was. I took action with the intention of trying to help someone and certainly not hurt them. And I did the exact opposite. And it was so powerful when somebody else stepped in for that person and said, so the thing with Paul is he would have been trying to do this. And he was at all the right and the person went, you know what, I know that. And it diffused the whole situation. We ended up having a phone call about it. And it was a beautiful phone call. There was no tension at all. But it was all about that person staying clear on the difference between good intention versus the action and the way it landed for them. And of course, I felt terrible that it landed the exact opposite to what I was intending, but it got cleaned up really quickly. And one of our, you know, prominent ID practitioners, Greg Meyer, often says, you know, with ID, we can't avoid the conflict. We're going to have conflict. What ID helps you do is clean it up real quick. And that's the thing. Doesn't mean you can be reckless, because we've got a tool to clean things up. But no matter how hard you try, even when you know, with what I know, I did what I thought was going to be the most loving thing for someone, and I didn't achieve that. But the cleanup was much faster. All right. What about for the complete drive here? Given that it's the drive that wants to avoid conflict in the first place. So if there is something that you need to deal with that, you know, might have been a source of tension for you, firstly, you need to create enough time to go through it. And that's always going to err. You're better off creating longer time and not needing it than saying it's 5 minutes and then needs to go longer, because a completer won't engage if they don't feel there's been enough time allowed. But you need to sort of get in and get on a roll. And I didn't actually say this here, but there's got to be enough time. It's about spending time to just build up to it. You know, there's got to get like on a roll to then deal with it. You can't just go in and say, right, we said we'll meet at 4 o'clock. It's 4 o'clock. This is our agenda, resolve conflict. So let's get to work. It sort of doesn't work like that for a completer. Now, the more advanced notice they've got, the more that they can warm up to it themselves, the better, of course. But, you know, if you can just spend that time to connect, that's really valuable. And I've had, I would say, many, when I think about where this has happened best, it's when someone says, you know what, let's go and have a meal together. And out of having a meal and a wine together and just spending some time, they can, you know, maybe it's an hour or something, they get on a roll, and then there's like this energy shift where they can start to get into it, because it's sort of step, might be, you know, phase 3 of the conversation or something, but they're on that roll. And for the avoid complete drive, you know, given that you've got this limited time to keep their attention, if you've got several things that you want to address, given it's a drive that's going to, you know, react pretty quickly, I find it really helpful to just summarize something in an email or a text message or something where you can say, this is what I want to talk to you about, so they can sort of read the context of it and they've got it. And the second thing I would say is, actually, when you start it, just say, I need you to hear me out. I want you to listen and not react. And the people are really good at that. They go, okay, you're right. Yep, I know I'm vulnerable to do it. So you're right. Okay, let me just clear some things out of my head so I can sit here and I can focus on you. Doesn't mean you can talk for an hour, but it means that they're like, okay, you've got me. I'll do that for you. But they might need to just be reminded to do that. And then get it down to 1 or 2 things, not a shopping list. Steve, I see you've got a question in the chat. I'll come to that for you in a second. Any questions or comments about the complete drive? All right, so let's move on to the improvised drive. No matter how grave or negative the issue might be for you, it needs to feel like you want the, you know, it's got to have that sense of lightness, positivity, and future. Like, you want a future with me, right? You know, like we're still going to be in, like I often say to people, if you sort of have that sense of, we're good, we're still going forward, there's still an us, you know, this is about how we do the future together, and they feel that there's that positive energy. That's really important to an improviser. Even keeping it light and humorous if possible, like that's, you might need to get yourself to a different place first, even if you're an improviser yourself. But that sense of, there is a future, it's future focused, it's about what we're going to be doing together. That's a much better way for that to work, and have it so that it's interactive, like not just the conversation is interactive, but the problem solving part is interactive. Like, well, what do you think we should do? How would you suggest we do this? What if this? What if that? You know, the brainstorming of it is really engaging and very healing for an improviser to tackle it that way. When you're trying to resolve a conflict with an avoid improvise, like we talked about with the completers, this is the drive that's very sensitive to conflict, because it's risk. It's got risk all over it. They would much rather just take it on board internally and I'll figure out a way to just deal with this myself, than get into a conversation or a situation that's going to be risky with what I say and what the impact could be. And, you know, it's all in the moment and off the cuff, and that's not the way that works best for an avoid improvise. So it's so important that if you're going to try and resolve something with an avoid improviser, you take that heat away, that you create a safe environment that's not all emotional, that's calm, somewhat factual or logical, and we just talk it through, level-headed together, and we'll figure this out, you know, without any of that heat. But if they don't feel safe, they'll shut down again. So that's all the more reason why you might want to be in stride first yourself, to make sure that this can happen. And then, given that there's got to be a permanence about it for the avoid improvise, don't just walk away and feel like you want to come back and check in a little down the track. It might be later that day, it might be in a week's time. Like, how is everything now? Did it all work out? Like, has it actually all worked out? So that permanence is there for the avoid improviser. And then they'll feel like you really got it. So Steve, I might come to your question. Are there, you asked in the chat, are the components of each drive where conflict is needed to trigger action? Some people like time pressures to get going. So do you want to maybe expand on your question and see what the group think?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. It's, for example, an axe, if it gets blunt, the only way to get it sharp again is to bring friction and to bring conflict to it. So therefore, potentially some situations need conflict or need some sort of trigger to get action. So that's the principle. And I tend to agree with you. How do we embrace tension and the emotion and the energy from conflict and tension to build strength. So from the example of the axe, and you bring a grinder to it, which is all sparks and hot, there are certain times when conflict is needed. So how do you pick that? What parts of the IDs do we look for to do that in a healthy way rather than being destructive?
I'm wondering whether I agree with the premise, that conflict is needed. That's what I'm wondering. Like, synergy is a good thing. And conflict is needed for the dynamics needed for the synergy, but I don't know they're needed for the conflict. So if people's needs are met, then they maybe don't need the conflict. That's what I'm wondering.
It's I suppose the question is if there's a status quo. Now, status quo needs to be adjusted because we'll die if the status quo remains. Like, for example, some couples, they never have a fight, but they never talk. So therefore, in about 30 years, their relationship's going to be dead. In business, the same thing. If you don't attend to some things, it's going to die off. And a good example of that is Kodak with films. They stuck their head in the sand, and Kodak disappeared in industry and business. So that sort of concept. So I'm not saying you must have conflict. It's just something when you're talking through things. Is there a time when you need to structure? Conflict's possibly a harsh word, but something to break the tension of the status quo. Yeah, a catalyst. Yeah, good. That's a better word. Yeah.
Okay. Steve, I might just flag that and deal with that in our masterclass.
Yeah, that's fine.
There's a good teaser, because I think it's a really good point, and you've got both a personal and a business dimension to that, which I think would be really worth unpacking. And I'd love to get the Brains Trust, input on that. So, yeah, if you don't mind, we could maybe.
No problem at all.
Okay, thank you. All right, guys, we're almost out of time. I've got 2 more quick tips to give you. Find a higher ground. Once you've, we said before, the issue is not the issue. There's probably something bigger behind it. So finding what you do have in common, like where are you already at peace? Where are you already linked? And there will be, like, go from ground level to 10,000 feet. If you're not linked there, go to 30,000 feet. But what do you have in common? Is it a common goal? Is it a shared set of values? Like, there will be something. Is it just as simple as we want to keep working together? Like, okay, we get that. If you start from where you are connected, that's a much better place to start from to then manage whatever the conflict is, because it's in service of whatever that bigger picture is. And then I would say, finally, it's probably not resolved when you think it's resolved. Like a rocket ship that's always going off course, there might be some things that weren't said, that weren't resolved, not intentionally, just were missed, or that, in the passage of time, you realize there's a little bit more. So managing and resolving conflict often means you need to just keep your eye on it and come back and revisit it and check what's the status. And just the checking can, for different IDs, provide that level of care that helps them heal. And that's important in the management of conflict. So with that, we're right on time. I can't believe how that played out, but that's very cool. So thank you all for being here today. This is such a critical topic. We will send the slides out with the recording of today's webinar. And we've already got our first question from Steve to tackle in our ID Masterclass. And that's when we will get into some of the nuances and look at some of the use cases around this topic in more depth. Until then, stay in stride. Thanks for being here, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. Take care, everyone.